On the morning of November 14, 1866, Dr. Samuel Whitmore arrived at the Longford County Courthouse in rural Pennsylvania, carrying a leather satchel that would expose one of the most bizarre criminal conspiracies in American history. Inside that satchel were the preserved organs of a white poodle named Duchess, a dog that had died and been resurrected 4 times in the span of 18 months. But Duchess wasn't the only victim. The dog belonged to Margaret O'Sullivan, Longford's most successful marriage broker. In the post-Civil War matrimonial boom, Margaret had arranged over 200 unions between war widows and returning soldiers. She was beloved, trusted, a pillar of the community. But Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed something that would turn the town's understanding of Margaret upside down. The dog had been poisoned, not once, but repeatedly. And the same poison found in Duchess's tissue had been detected in 4 deceased men, all rejected suitors of women Margaret represented. But the truth was far more terrifying than simple murder. Before we uncover the truth about the Longford matchmaker's poodle and the deaths that haunted a small Pennsylvania town, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We bring you the darkest, most forgotten chapters of history that textbooks won't teach you. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's step back into 1865, when America was trying to heal from its bloodiest conflict, and one woman saw opportunity in the wreckage. The spring of 1865 brought 2 profound changes to Longford County, Pennsylvania. The first was relief. The Civil War had finally ended after 4 years of carnage that claimed over 600,000 American lives. The second was a demographic catastrophe that would reshape the social fabric of rural communities for a generation. Longford County had sent 847 men to war. Only 312 returned alive. Of those who came back, 89 were missing limbs, blind, or psychologically shattered by what they'd witnessed at Gettysburg, Antietam, and Cold Harbor. The county was suddenly populated by war widows, young women who'd never married because the men were gone, and a scattered handful of intact males who found themselves in unprecedented demand. Into this disrupted world stepped Margaret O'Sullivan, a 43-year-old Irish immigrant who'd lost her own husband to typhoid fever in 1862. Margaret had a gift that seemed almost supernatural in an age before telephones or classified advertisements. She could match people. She remembered every unmarried person in a 50-mile radius, knew their temperaments, their financial situations, their family histories, and their secret preferences. Her home on Elderwood Lane became a kind of romantic embassy. Women would visit Margaret's parlor, sit in the high-backed chair by her fireplace, and describe what they sought in a husband. Margaret would nod, pour tea, and ask probing questions. Can you tolerate a man who drinks, dearie? Would you marry a farmer, if it meant comfort? Or do you need a man of learning? What about a widower with 3 children? Could you mother another woman's blood? Within weeks, Margaret would arrange an introduction. Her success rate was extraordinary. By early 1866, she'd brokered 214 marriages with only 12 known failures. The Longford Gazette published a glowing profile calling her Cupid's ambassador in petticoats. Local clergy praised her for preventing the moral decay that befell communities with too many unmarried women. Margaret charged modest fees, usually $5 per successful match, and donated portions to the Presbyterian Church. But Margaret had a constant companion that became almost as famous as she was, Duchess, a white toy poodle she'd brought from Philadelphia in 1864. The dog was always at Margaret's side during consultations, curled on a velvet cushion, WATC. Hing the proceedings with dark, intelligent eyes. Margaret claimed Duchess could sense compatible souls. If Duchess takes to a man, she would tell her clients, he's got a good heart, no matter how rough his exterior. The women believed her. In that superstitious age, still influenced by folk traditions from the old country, many people attributed mystical qualities to animals. Duchess became a test. Suitors knew they needed to win over both Margaret and her dog. But in the summer of 1865, something shifted in Margaret O'Sullivan's enterprise. The shift was subtle at first, imperceptible, and by the time anyone noticed the pattern, 4 men would be dead, and a small Pennsylvania town would never feel safe again. Robert Henshaw was a problem from the start. 28 years old, a former lieutenant who'd served under Sherman in Georgia, Henshaw returned to Longford with his military, pension, and an arrogance that grated on the local population. He wanted a wife, but not just any wife. He wanted Lillian Bradshaw, the 22-year-old daughter of the town's wealthiest mill owner. Lillian had retained Margaret's services in July, and Margaret initially considered Henshaw a possibility. He was educated, financially stable, and handsome in a severe way. But during his interview at Elderwood Lane, something went wrong. Duchess growled at Henshaw the moment he entered the parlor, a deep, sustained rumble that Margaret had never heard from the typically docile Poodle. "Your dog doesn't care for me," Henshaw said, his voice tight with irritation. "Duchess is an excellent judge of character," Margaret replied carefully. "Perhaps this isn't the right match, Mr. Henshaw." But Henshaw wouldn't accept rejection. He visited Margaret's home 3 more times that August, each time bearing gifts for the dog, cuts of expensive meat, a beaded collar, even a small cushion stuffed with down feathers. Duchess refused everything, and continued to growl whenever Henshaw appeared. On August 23rd, Margaret formally withdrew Henshaw from consideration for Lillian's hand. She'd found Lillian another suitor, Thomas Garrett, a quieter man who'd lost an arm at Chancellorsville but owned fertile farmland. Lillian agreed to the match. 2 days later, Robert Henshaw was found dead in his rented room above the Longford General Store. The landlady discovered him at noon, slumped over his writing desk, his face a disturbing shade of blue-gray. A half-eaten lunch sat beside him, bread, cheese, and cold chicken. Dr. Cyrus Campbell, Longford's only physician at the time, concluded that Henshaw had suffered a heart attack. "The war puts tremendous strain on a man's constitution," Campbell wrote in his report. "The heart gives out without warning, particularly in those who experienced significant combat trauma." The community accepted this explanation without question. Henshaw was buried in the Presbyterian Cemetery on August 28, 1865. Only 17 people attended the funeral. He'd made few friends during his brief time back in Longford. What nobody knew was that Duchess had died the night before Henshaw's funeral. Margaret buried the dog quietly in her garden at dawn, telling no one. And 2 days after Duchess's death, Margaret appeared at church with an identical white poodle, also named Duchess. James Thornby was different from Robert Henshaw in almost every way. Where Henshaw had been abrasive and entitled, Thornby was charming and respectful. A 41-year-old merchant who'd been too old for the draft, Thornby had profited during the war by selling supplies to the Union Army. He was wealthy, well-connected, and seeking a much younger wife to give him the children his first wife had been unable to provide before her death in 1863. Margaret arranged a meeting between Thornby and Catherine Wells, a 19-year-old beauty whose father had died at Shiloh. Catherine was practical about marriage. She needed security, and Thornby could provide it. The courtship proceeded normally through September. Duchess showed no particular reaction to Thornby during his visits, which Margaret interpreted as acceptance. But in early October, Catherine confessed to Margaret that Thornby's attentions had become overwhelming. "He wants to marry immediately," Catherine said, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "He speaks of begetting children as though I'm livestock, and he's asked me to sign papers that would give him control of the small inheritance my father left. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I don't think I can go through with this." Margaret counseled Catherine to trust her instincts. She sent a polite letter to Thornby suggesting they slow the courtship. Thornby appeared at Elderwood Lane the next day, furious. "I've paid you handsomely for this arrangement," he said, his voice rising. "I've been patient, I've courted her properly. Now you're trying to sabotage." He stopped mid-sentence because Duchess had begun convulsing. The dog writhed on her cushion, foam gathering at her mouth, her body jerking violently. Margaret rushed to the animal, cradling her as the seizure continued for nearly 2 minutes. "Get out," Margaret whispered to Thornby. "Get out of my house." Thornby left, slamming the door. Duchess recovered slowly, remaining lethargic for days. Margaret told several neighbors that the dog had been poisoned. She suspected someone had thrown tainted meat into her yard. On October 19th, James Thornby attended a dinner party at the home of Judge Harold Mercer, one of Longford's most prominent citizens. 12 people were present that evening. The meal consisted of roast beef, potatoes, green beans, and apple pie. Around 10 o'clock, Thornby complained of stomach pain. By 11, he was vomiting violently. Judge Mercer's wife helped him to a guest bedroom, assuming he'd simply overindulged in food and wine. By morning, James Thornby was dead. Dr. Campbell was called to examine the body. He noted the vomiting, the severe dehydration, and what he described as an unusually distended appearance to the abdomen, but with no understanding of toxicology and no reason to suspect foul play at a dinner attended by Longford's elite. Campbell attributed the death to acute gastric distress, possibly caused by spoiled food or a perforated ulcer. The other dinner guests showed no symptoms. The food was examined and found to be fresh. Thornby was buried on October 22nd, 3 days after the funeral, Margaret O'Sullivan's Poodle died again, and once again, Margaret appeared shortly afterward with an identical replacement. By winter, Margaret O'Sullivan's reputation had only grown. Despite the deaths of 2 former clients, a coincidence no one had reason to connect, she continued arranging successful marriages. But she'd also become more selective, turning away several men she deemed unsuitable without clear explanation. One of those rejected suitors was Peter Dalton, a 35-year-old carpenter with a violent reputation. Dalton had beaten his first wife so severely that she'd fled to her family in Ohio, taking their 2 children. The story was known around Longford, but in that era, a man's treatment of his wife was largely considered a private matter. When Dalton sought Margaret's help in finding a new bride, she refused outright. "I don't broker arrangements for men of questionable character," she told him in her parlor, with Duchess watching from her cushion. Dalton's face reddened. "You've got no right to judge me, woman. What happened between me and my wife is none of your concern. I have every right to protect the women who seek my counsel," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "I won't help you, Mr. Dalton. Please leave." Dalton left, but he began spreading rumors through Longford's taverns. He called Margaret a fraud, a witch, and worse. He suggested her matchmaking success came from dark practices. He specifically mentioned the dog, that unnatural creature that watches everything with demon eyes. Oh, December 8th, Dalton made a fatal mistake. He encountered Margaret returning from the market and followed her home, shouting insults. When she reached her front door, he grabbed her arm. "You'll regret crossing me," he hissed. Duchess lunged from Margaret's arms and bit Dalton's hand, a surprisingly vicious attack for such a small dog. Dalton stumbled backward, blood dripping from puncture wounds. "I'll kill that rat," he snarled. "You and your devil dog both." 2 nights later, Dalton was found in an alley behind Murphy's Tavern, dead at age 35. His body showed signs of prolonged vomiting. His lips were cracked and bleeding. Dr. Campbell, growing concerned about the cluster of deaths among younger men, performed a more thorough examination this time. "I cannot definitively determine the cause," Campbell wrote in his report. "The symptoms suggest poisoning, but Mr. Dalton spent the evening drinking heavily, and it's possible he consumed contaminated alcohol. Several barrels at Murphy's Tavern have been known to contain impurities. The tavern's alcohol was tested. Nothing unusual was found. Dalton was buried on December 12th. The Longford Gazette published a brief obituary noting his carpentry skills and glossing over his troubled personal life. Duchess died on December 14th, 2 days after Dalton's funeral. By now, a few people had begun to notice the pattern of the dog's deaths and replacements, but Margaret had explanations ready. The first Duchess had been old, she said. The second had eaten poisoned meat meant for rats. The third had a weak heart. These things happened with small dogs, she insisted. She kept replacing them with identical animals as a comfort to herself and to maintain continuity for her clients who'd grown fond of the original Duchess. Most people accepted this explanation, but not everyone. Clara Morrison was 17 years old and worked as Margaret O'Sullivan's part-time housemaid. She cleaned Margaret's home twice a week, helped with laundry, and occasionally assisted during client consultations by serving tea. Clara was observant in the way young people often are when they're trying to understand the adult world. In early February 1866, Clara noticed something odd. She was cleaning Margaret's kitchen when she found a small bottle tucked behind the flour canister. The bottle was unmarked, filled with a white powder. When Clara asked about it, Margaret's reaction was sharp and immediate. "Don't touch that," Margaret said, snatching the bottle away. "That's rat poison. We've been having terrible problems with vermin in the cellar." Clara nodded, but something about Margaret's tone unsettled her. And Clara had been working in the house for months. She'd never seen evidence of rats. 2 weeks later, Clara was dusting the parlor when she overheard an argument between Margaret and a client, Benjamin Hayes, a former corporal seeking a wife. Hayes had been rejected as a match for one of Margaret's clients, and he was demanding to know why. "Your temperament is unsuitable," Margaret said coolly. "I've made my decision." "You're not God," Hayes shot back. "You don't get to decide who deserves happiness. Get out of my house, Mr. Hayes. Not until you tell me the truth. Is it because I questioned you about those men who died? Henshaw, Thornby, Dalton. They all came through your parlor, and now they're dead." Clara pressed herself against the wall, listening. "Those deaths are tragic coincidences," Margaret said. "Now leave, or I'll have the sheriff remove you." Hayes left, but not quietly. He slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. Duchess, curled on her cushion, didn't even open her eyes. 3 days later, Benjamin Hayes fell violently ill after eating dinner at a church social. Unlike the previous victims, Hayes survived, barely. Dr. Campbell treated him for severe poisoning, noting symptoms consistent with arsenic exposure, though he couldn't determine how Hayes had ingested the poison. Hayes recovered after 2 agonizing weeks, but left Longford immediately afterward, moving to Pittsburgh. But his survival created a problem. Hayes had publicly accused Margaret O'Sullivan of being connected to suspicious deaths, and now he'd nearly died himself, at a church social attended by over 60 people, where Margaret had been serving refreshments. Clara Morrison went to her father, Edward Morrison, a respected farmer and Presbyterian deacon. She told him about the mysterious bottle, about the pattern of deaths, about Hayes's accusations. Edward Morrison listened, then did something that would change everything. He went to Sheriff Thomas Brennan and asked him to investigate Margaret O'Sullivan. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. The case is about to take a turn that shocked investigators and revealed a conspiracy that went deeper than anyone imagined. Let's discover what happens next. Sheriff Thomas Brennan was 54 years old and had held his position for nearly 2 decades. He'd dealt with theft, assault, the occasional murder born of drunken rage, but nothing had prepared him for what Edward Morrison was suggesting. "You're telling me Margaret O'Sullivan is a murderer?" Brennan said, his skepticism evident. "The woman who's arranged half the marriages in this county?" "I'm telling you there's a pattern," Morrison replied. 4 men who crossed her path are dead, a 5th barely survived, and my daughter found poison in her kitchen. Brennan was reluctant. Margaret O'Sullivan was beloved in Longford. Accusing her without solid evidence could destroy his career. But Morrison was persistent, and other community members were beginning to whisper. The coincidences were too numerous to ignore. On March 3, 1866, Sheriff Brennan visited Elderwood Lane under the pretense of discussing a theft that had occurred in Margaret's neighborhood. He brought with him Deputy William Foster, ostensibly to take notes but really to serve as a witness. Margaret welcomed them cordially, offered tea, which both men declined, and answered questions about the theft. While Margaret spoke with Brennan, Deputy Foster's eyes wandered around the parlor. He noticed Duchess on her cushion, noticed the dog's unusual stillness. He noticed something else too, a slight tremor in Margaret's hands when Brennan mentioned Benjamin Hayes's name. "Terrible thing, what happened to Hayes," Brennan said casually. "Poisoned at a church social." "Yes, terrible," Margaret agreed, "though I understand he's recovering in Pittsburgh. You were at that social, weren't you, Mrs. O'Sullivan?" "I was. I brought shortbread cookies." Several people complimented them. After the interview, Brennan and Foster left, but Brennan's instincts were now activated. He requested that Dr. Campbell review the deaths of Henshaw, Thornby, and Dalton with fresh eyes. Campbell, already troubled by the cluster of deaths, agreed to consult with a colleague. That colleague was Dr. Samuel Whitmore, a physician from Philadelphia who'd studied in Europe and had expertise in the emerging field of forensic medicine. Whitmore arrived in Longford on March 15, 1866. He reviewed Campbell's notes on all 4 cases and immediately noted similarities: the gastric distress, the vomiting, the discoloration of the skin, the rapidity of death after symptom onset. "These symptoms are consistent with arsenic poisoning," Whitmore told Brennan, "but we need to test the bodies." Here, the investigation faced a significant obstacle. Exhumation required permission from families and approval from the church. 2 of the men had no family in Longford. Thornby's relatives in Philadelphia refused to allow exhumation, not wanting the scandal. But Robert Henshaw's mother, who lived in Harrisburg and had been devastated by her son's death, gave permission immediately. On March 22nd, Henshaw's body was exhumed from the Presbyterian cemetery. Dr. Whitmore performed an autopsy using the Marsh test, a then cutting-edge technique that could detect arsenic in human tissue. The test was positive. Robert Henshaw had been murdered with arsenic poisoning, but the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Clara Morrison told investigators about another detail she'd remembered: the dogs. Margaret kept replacing Duchess, claiming natural deaths, but what if the dogs were also being poisoned? "Where does she bury them?" Whitmore asked. "In her garden," Clara said, "behind the house near the rose bushes." On March 28th, armed with a warrant, Sheriff Brennan and Dr. Whitmore excavated Margaret O'Sullivan's garden. They found 3 small graves, each containing the remains of a white poodle. Whitmore took samples from each dog. The results were unequivocal. All 3 dogs had died of arsenic poisoning. The levels of arsenic in their tissue were extraordinarily high, far more than would be used for rat poison. Someone had been deliberately poisoning these animals repeatedly over the course of months. But why would anyone poison their own dog? The answer, when it came, revealed a scheme so calculated, so coldly manipulative, that it would shock Victorian America's already shocked sensibilities. Dr. Whitmore had brought Margaret's current dog, the 4th Duchess, to his temporary laboratory for examination. The dog was alive, seemingly healthy, but Whitmore noticed something odd. The animal was unnaturally docile, almost lethargic. He took blood samples and found traces of arsenic, not enough to kill but enough to keep the dog in a constant state of mild poisoning. She's been poisoning them slowly, Whitmore realized, keeping them sick but alive, then administering a fatal dose when needed. But why? Sheriff Brennan didn't have to wait long for the answer. On April 2nd, he arrested Margaret O'Sullivan in her parlor, with Duchess watching from her cushion. Among the items seized from her home were 3 bottles of arsenic, one nearly empty, a ledger containing names and dates, and a series of letters that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy. What authorities discovered next would reveal that Margaret O'Sullivan wasn't just a murderer. She was an extortionist, a blackmailer, and a woman who'd turned the sacred institution of matchmaking into a profitable enterprise built on fear, manipulation, and death. The investigation that followed Margaret O'Sullivan's arrest would take 11 months and would involve testimony from over 70 witnesses. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who'd turned grief and desperation into a business model that was both brilliant and monstrous. Margaret's ledger was the key to understanding her operation. Written in meticulous handwriting, it contained the names of every client she'd served since 1864. But it also contained something else, a separate column marked with symbols, small crosses, circles, and daggers. Dr. Whitmore and Sheriff Brennan eventually decoded the system. The crosses marked successful matches. The circles marked clients who'd paid additional fees for premium services. And the daggers marked men who'd been deemed problematic. Robert Henshaw, dagger. James Thornby, dagger. Peter Dalton, dagger. Benjamin Hayes, dagger. But there were other dagger marks, 7 in total. Investigators tracked down the men corresponding to those marks. 4 were dead. The other 3 had left Longford suddenly in late 1865 and early 1866, apparently after receiving threatening letters. One of those men, Edmund Price, came forward after reading about Margaret's arrest in the Pittsburgh Gazette. Price was a merchant who'd courted one of Margaret's clients in the fall of 1865. The courtship had gone well until Margaret abruptly terminated it, claiming the woman had changed her mind. When Price protested, Margaret invited him to her parlor for a private conversation. "She told me that I should leave Longford," Price testified at Margaret's trial. "She said that certain men who'd argued with her had suffered unfortunate accidents. She mentioned Henshaw and Thornby by name. Then she said that for $50 she could ensure no such misfortune befell me. I paid her the very next day and left town within the week. I was terrified." Margaret O'Sullivan wasn't just arranging marriages. She was running a protection racket, using murder and the threat of murder to extort money from men she deemed problematic. The deaths served multiple purposes. They removed obstacles. They generated fear that made extortion easier. And they enhanced Margaret's reputation as a woman whose judgment should not be questioned. But investigators still didn't understand the dog's role until they found Margaret's letters. She'd been corresponding with her sister in Philadelphia, and those letters revealed the full scope of her manipulation. The dogs, all of them, had been props in an elaborate performance. Margaret would slowly poison Duchess with small doses of arsenic, making the dog ill but not fatally so. When a problematic man visited her parlor, the dog would be agitated from the low-level poisoning, growling, shaking, appearing disturbed. Margaret would interpret this as the dog sensing something wrong with the man's character. "Duchess doesn't like you" became Margaret's socially acceptable way of rejecting unsuitable men without having to provide real reasons. It was genius, in a twisted way. People would accept a dog's mystical judgment more readily than a woman's personal assessment. When Margaret decided a man needed to be eliminated, she would poison him using arsenic administered in food or drink, usually at church socials or community events where she helped prepare refreshments. Then, shortly before or after the man's death, she would administer a fatal dose of arsenic to Duchess. The dog would die seemingly from the same mysterious affliction affecting the man. This served 2 purposes. First, it created the appearance that some environmental toxin was affecting both humans and animals, making poisoning less obvious. Second, it played into Margaret's carefully crafted image of herself as a woman with an almost supernatural connection to her dog, The death of Duchess validated Margaret's initial warning that something was wrong with the rejected man. Even the dog died from whatever poison was in the air. She would then quickly replace Duchess with an identical dog purchased from a breeder in Philadelphia, maintaining the illusion of continuity. Most people in Longford never realized they were looking at different animals. Dr. Whitmore called it one of the most sophisticated murder schemes I've encountered in my career. Mrs. O'Sullivan understood human psychology, social dynamics, and the limitations of medical knowledge in rural areas. She exploited all of it. Margaret O'Sullivan's trial began on June 4, 1866, in the Longford County Courthouse. It lasted 6 weeks and became a national sensation. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco covered the proceedings. The phrase "the matchmaker, Poodle" became shorthand for a certain type of gendered violence. A woman using perceived feminine intuition and harmlessness to mask calculated brutality. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Howard Tremaine, who presented overwhelming evidence: the exhumed bodies showing arsenic poisoning, the poisoned dogs, the ledger, the extortion letters, and testimony from dozens of witnesses. Margaret's defense attorney, Charles Whitfield, attempted to argue that Margaret was a victim of circumstance, a widow trying to survive in a male-dominated world who'd been falsely accused by men who resented her success and independence. But the evidence was too strong. Most damning was Clara Morrison's testimony about finding the arsenic, combined with the testimony of 3 women who'd been Margaret's clients. These women revealed that Margaret had told them which men to avoid based on Duchess's reactions, and in each case, those men had either died or been extorted shortly afterward. The all-male jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found Margaret O'Sullivan guilty of 4 counts of murder in the first degree and 3 counts of extortion. On July 18, 1866, Judge Harold Mercer, the same man who'd hosted the dinner party where James Thornby died, sentenced Margaret to death by hanging. Pennsylvania had abolished public executions in 1834, so the sentence would be carried out in the Longford County Jail. Margaret showed no emotion when the sentence was read. She was taken back to her cell, where she would spend the next 6 months awaiting execution. Margaret O'Sullivan was hanged on January 9, 1867, at 10:00 a.m. 27 witnesses attended, as required by Pennsylvania law. She was 45 years old. According to the execution report filed by Sheriff Brennan, Margaret remained silent throughout the proceedings except for a final statement she made on the gallows. "I regret nothing except being caught. In this world, women have few paths to power. I chose mine. I would choose it again." She refused the attendance of clergy and died, by all accounts, with the same composure she'd shown throughout her trial. The community of Longford struggled to process what had happened. Many of Margaret's clients, women whose marriages she'd successfully arranged, found themselves questioning everything. Had their husbands been chosen for genuine compatibility, or had they simply been the ones willing to pay Margaret's fees and pose no threat to her operation? The Presbyterian Church launched an internal investigation into how Margaret had been able to poison people at church socials without detection. They discovered that Margaret had volunteered to help prepare refreshments at virtually every community event for 2 years. She'd had access to food and drink preparation areas largely unsupervised, a privilege granted because of her status as a respected widow and church member. The church implemented new policies requiring at least 3 people to be present during all food preparation for community events. Several other churches in Pennsylvania adopted similar policies after hearing about the Margaret O'Sullivan case. Dr. Samuel Whitmore published a paper in the American Medical Journal about the case, titled "Detection of Serial Poisoning in Rural Communities, the O'Sullivan Matter." His paper helped establish protocols for investigating suspicious deaths and was cited in forensic medicine texts for decades. But perhaps the most significant aftermath involved the marriageable women of Longford County. In the year following Margaret's execution, the marriage rate in Longford dropped by 63%. Women who'd previously sought Margaret's services found themselves without a trusted intermediary in a society where independent courtship was difficult and risky. Several families left Longford entirely, unable to shake the association with the scandal. Benjamin Hayes, the man who'd survived Margaret's poisoning attempt, returned to Longford in 1868. He testified before the Pennsylvania state legislature in support of new laws regulating marriage brokers and requiring professional licensing for anyone operating as a matchmaker. The legislation passed in 1869 but was rarely enforced. The house on Elderwood Lane where Margaret had conducted her business was purchased by a merchant family from Philadelphia in 1868. They demolished it completely and built a new structure on the property. According to local legend, they first excavated the entire garden, removing all the soil where the poisoned dogs had been buried, and replacing it with fresh earth from a nearby farm. The case file on Margaret O'Sullivan, including her ledger, letters, and Dr. Whitmore's autopsy reports, is preserved in the Pennsylvania State Archives. The ledger, with its mysterious symbols and meticulous record-keeping, remains one of the most chilling documents in American criminal history, and the fourth Duchess, the dog that survived Margaret's arrest, was adopted by Clara Morrison's family. The dog lived another 8 years, dying peacefully in 1875. Clara, who'd been instrumental in exposing Margaret's crimes, never married. She became a teacher and spent 53 years educating children in rural Pennsylvania schools. In her later years, she gave several interviews about her experiences, always emphasizing the same point: evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and a forked tail. Sometimes it pours your tea, compliments your dress, and asks about your family. That's what makes it so dangerous. The Margaret O'Sullivan case had reverberations that extended far beyond Longford County, Pennsylvania. It exposed vulnerabilities in post-Civil War American society and raised uncomfortable questions about gender, power, and the emerging role of women in public life during Reconstruction. Margaret's crimes effectively destroyed the informal marriage broker industry in rural Pennsylvania. Women who'd operated similar services, most of them legitimately, found themselves viewed with suspicion. Several were forced out of business by rumors and community distrust, even though no evidence suggested they'd engaged in any wrongdoing. This created a vacuum in communities where the gender imbalance caused by war casualties remained acute. Without trusted intermediaries, many women found themselves unable to navigate the courtship process safely. Some historians argue that the collapse of the marriage broker system contributed to increased instances of predatory courtship behavior and hasty, ill-considered marriages in rural communities throughout the late 1860s. The professional matchmaking industry wouldn't recover in America until the early 20th century, and when it did, it emerged in urban centers with strict regulations, formal contracts, and professional oversight, all direct responses to the legacy of cases like Margaret O'Sullivan's. Dr. Samuel Whitmore's work on the O'Sullivan case advanced the field of forensic toxicology in America significantly. His use of the Marsh test to detect arsenic in exhumed remains was among the first applications of this technique in a rural criminal case. His success demonstrated that sophisticated forensic methods could be applied outside major cities, even in communities with limited medical resources. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of communities to poisoning crimes when local physicians lacked specialized knowledge. Dr. Cyrus Campbell, Longford's physician, had missed 4 poisoning deaths because he'd attributed the symptoms to natural causes. After the trial, Campbell spent 6 months studying with Whitmore in Philadelphia, learning forensic techniques. He returned to Longford and served the community for another 20 years, but colleagues reported he was haunted by his failure to detect Margaret's crimes earlier. Medical schools began incorporating forensic medicine into their curricula, partly in response to cases like O'Sullivan's. The American Medical Association established guidelines in 1870 for investigating suspicious deaths, explicitly mentioning the need to consider poisoning even in the absence of obvious evidence. The Margaret O'Sullivan case forced Victorian American society to confront an uncomfortable reality. Women could be calculating, violent criminals. This challenged prevailing assumptions about female nature and feminine virtue that were central to 19th century gender ideology. Newspapers covering the trial struggled with this cognitive dissonance. Many articles emphasized Margaret's age 45 was considered elderly for a woman at the time, her widowhood, and her Irish immigrant background, attempting to categorize her as an outsider who didn't represent true American womanhood. Some publications suggested that Margaret's crimes resulted from the absence of male supervision, AR, arguing that widows required greater oversight from male relatives or community authorities. But other commentators, particularly in more progressive publications, used the case to argue for women's legal equality. If women were capable of crimes as sophisticated as Margaret's, these writers suggested, then women were clearly capable of the rational thought and moral agency that men possessed, and therefore deserved full legal rights, including property ownership and suffrage. Feminist activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton referenced the O'Sullivan case in speeches advocating for women's legal equality, though carefully. Stanton argued that Margaret's crimes revealed women's intellectual capability for complex planning, a capability that suffrage opponents claimed women lacked. However, Stanton's use of a murderer to argue for women's rights was controversial even among suffragists, and she largely abandoned this line of reasoning after criticism from colleagues. The case also influenced literature. Several popular novels published in the late 1860s and early 1870s featured female villains who used poison and social manipulation, a marked departure from earlier Victorian fiction where female characters were generally portrayed as purely virtuous or purely fallen. Literary historians trace a direct line from the O'Sullivan case to more psychologically complex portrayals of female characters in American fiction. What often gets overlooked in discussions of Margaret O'Sullivan is the broader context of post-Civil War trauma and social disruption. Margaret had lost her own husband to disease during the war years. She'd watched her community hemorrhage men to battlefield death. She'd seen the desperation of women suddenly forced to compete for a limited pool of potential husbands. Some modern psychologists who've studied the case argue that Margaret's crimes reflected a kind of vicarious control-seeking in a world where she'd lost control over her own circumstances. By determining who married whom, who lived and who died, Margaret created an illusion of order in a chaotic post-war landscape. This doesn't excuse her actions. 4 men were murdered, others were terrorized and extorted. But it provides context. The Civil War created massive social disruption, particularly in rural communities. Traditional social structures collapsed. Gender ratios were catastrophically imbalanced. The informal systems that had governed courtship and marriage for generations stopped functioning. Into this vacuum stepped people like Margaret O'Sullivan, who saw opportunity in chaos. Her case was unusual in its violence, but the underlying dynamic, individuals exploiting post-war social disruption for personal gain, was common throughout Reconstruction-era America. The Margaret O'Sullivan case is now studied in criminal psychology courses as an example of female serial killing motivated by financial gain and power, rather than passion or mental illness. Her methodical approach, her use of a prop, the dog, to manipulate social perceptions, and her ability to maintain a respectable public persona while committing murders over an extended period, mark her as an early example of the organized predatory serial killer profile. Criminologists note that Margaret's crimes were enabled by her social position. As a middle-aged widow operating in a traditionally feminine sphere matchmaking, she aroused no suspicion. Her victims were all men who'd antagonized her in some way, which played into Victorian assumptions about women as reactive, rather than proactive aggressors. The community couldn't imagine that sweet Mrs. O'Sullivan, who made excellent shortbread and loved her little dog, could be systematically murdering people. This case study is now used to train law enforcement in recognizing that criminals don't conform to stereotypes, that predators can occupy trusted social roles, and that seemingly respectable community members can harbor dark secrets. One question that haunts the Margaret O'Sullivan case is whether she killed more people than the 4 confirmed victims. Her ledger showed 7 dagger marks, corresponding to 7 problematic men. 4 died. 3 were extorted and fled town. But Margaret had been operating as a matchmaker since 1864, a period of nearly 2 years before the first confirmed murder. Investigators in 1866 didn't have the resources to exhume and test all deceased men who'd passed through Margaret's parlor during that earlier period. Dr. Whitmore estimated that Margaret had encountered approximately 300 men in her matchmaking work. If even a small percentage of those men died under circumstances similar to Henshaw, Thornby, Dalton, and Hayes, the death toll could be significantly higher. Several researchers have attempted to track down death records from Longford County for 1864 to 1866, but rural record-keeping in that era was inconsistent. At least 6 other men who'd consulted with Margaret died during that period, but their causes of death were listed as various ailments, heart failure, stomach illness, consumption, that could have been poisoning, but could also have been natural causes. The truth is, we'll never know for certain how many people Margaret O'Sullivan killed. 4 is the confirmed number. The actual number may have been higher, perhaps significantly so. What do you think drove Margaret O'Sullivan to murder? Was it the financial gain, the sense of power over life and death, the trauma of loss during the war years, or something darker, a fundamental absence of empathy that allowed her to poison men and dogs with the same cold calculation? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you know of similar historical cases where trusted community members used their positions to commit terrible crimes, share those stories too. This case reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes the most dangerous people are those we trust most, the ones who pour our tea, offer their help, and seem to have our best interests at heart. Subscribe to The Silent Abbey for more lost chapters of American history. The story's too dark, too strange, and too revealing about human nature for conventional textbooks. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our next investigation into the shadows of the past. The Margaret O'Sullivan case file remains in the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg. If you're ever in the area, it's open to researchers by appointment. Looking at her ledger with those careful notes and cryptic symbols, you can't help but wonder what was going through her mind as she recorded each name, each match, each death. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten American horror story that history tried to bury,